The crisis is changing the global financial order, and Jake Chervinsky, the XRP analyst, whose frameworks have been more accurate about the institutional and governmental trajectory of XRP than almost any voice in the space, has been mapping exactly how that change connects to XRP in a way that the mainstream financial press is not covering, and that the retail crypto community has not fully assembled into a coherent picture. Tonight, that changes. The crisis, whether you're watching it through the lens of the US-Iran military escalation, the energy market instability that is fracturing the petrodollar arrangement that has underpinned dollar dominance since 1973, the geopolitical competition between American and Chinese payment infrastructure, or the structural fragility of the SWIFT-based correspondent banking system that has been the financial backbone of the global economy for 50 years, is not a separate story from XRP. It is the same story, and Jake Chervinsky has been the analyst most consistently connecting the dots between the macro crisis environment and the specific, documented, evidence-based case for why that environment accelerates every catalyst that XRP holders have been waiting for. Tonight, I'm going to break down Jake Chervinsky's framework for how the crisis changes the global financial order, why every dimension of that change points directly at XRP as the infrastructure asset at the center of the transition, what the US government has done and is doing that confirms Jake's thesis, why the institutional positioning of Goldman, BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America is consistent with a framework that takes the crisis seriously as an XRP catalyst, and what the price targets look like when the global financial order finishes changing, and XRP's role in the new order is priced into the market cap. Every data point I reference comes from publicly available geopolitical analysis, government records, institutional filings, regulatory documents, and on-chain data. Before I continue, this is not financial advice. I am sharing publicly available information for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. Let me start with Jake Chervinsky's framework, because understanding his analysis requires understanding why his approach to XRP is different from the standard crypto analyst playbook, and why that difference makes his crisis to XRP connection so much more credible than what most people in this space are producing. Jake Chervinsky does not analyze XRP as a cryptocurrency. He analyzes XRP as a geopolitical and monetary infrastructure asset whose value is determined by its position in the global financial architecture, rather than by retail sentiment or technical chart patterns. His framework draws on international relations theory, monetary history, geopolitical risk analysis, and the documented behavior of nation-states and financial institutions during periods of global monetary transition. It is the kind of framework that produces accurate predictions about large-scale, slow-moving, structural changes that most retail analysts miss because they are too focused on the weekly price chart to see the decade-long transition that the weekly price chart is embedded in. Jake's central thesis is that the global financial order is in the middle of a transition from a unipolar dollar-based settlement system to a multipolar settlement architecture, where multiple currencies and multiple settlement technologies compete for the transaction volume that currently flows exclusively through the SWIFT network. This transition has been underway for decades, accelerating since the 2008 financial crisis exposed the structural fragility of the dollar-denominated system, and reaching a critical acceleration point now because the geopolitical crises of 2026 have added urgency to every government and financial institution's planning timeline for the post-SWIFT world. The crisis dimension that Jake specifically identifies as the most significant for XRP's near-term trajectory is the convergence of three simultaneous stressors on the existing financial order. The first is the military escalation with Iran that threatens the energy infrastructure of the Persian Gulf and therefore the physical foundation of the petrodollar arrangement. The second is the accelerating de-dollarization effort of the BRICS coalition that has been building payment alternatives to SWIFT for a decade and is now receiving urgent political support from governments that the American sanctions regime has pressured. The third is the Federal Reserve's structural dilemma between maintaining dollar dominance through interest rate policy and managing the domestic economic consequences of that policy in an environment where the rest of the world is increasingly willing to pay the cost of dollar alternative infrastructure to escape American monetary policy transmission. Each of these three stressors individually would be significant for XRP's thesis. Together simultaneously, at the peak of the regulatory clarity window that the Clarity Act and the commodity classification have created, they produce what Jake Chervinsky calls the optimal crisis environment for XRP adoption. The crisis creates the urgency that converts the theoretical case for American-built digital payment infrastructure from a long-term planning consideration to an immediate operational necessity. And when the theoretical becomes immediately necessary, the adoption timeline compresses from years to months. Now let me walk through how each dimension of the crisis connects specifically to the US government actions that are accelerating the XRP catalyst sequence. The military escalation with Iran is the most immediately visible crisis dimension. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes daily. When US-Iran tensions escalate to the level that threatens that corridor, two things happen simultaneously for the global financial system. Oil prices spike, creating currency pressure in energy-importing nations, and the reliability of the SWIFT-based international payment infrastructure comes into question because the correspondent banking relationships that SWIFT depends on are subject to diplomatic pressure and sanction enforcement mechanisms that become contested in military escalation scenarios. The US government's response to the Iran escalation at the financial infrastructure level is to accelerate the development of American-built alternative payment rails that are more resilient to the disruptions that military escalation creates in the correspondent banking network. Ripple's technology, operating on a distributed ledger that does not depend on correspondent banking relationships that can be disrupted by diplomatic sanctions or military pressure, is the resilient alternative. The Treasury Department's evaluation of Ripple's technology for federal payment infrastructure, which Jake Chervinsky has documented through the public record of Treasury working groups and interagency coordination processes, is being conducted with the Iran escalation as a backdrop that makes the urgency of having a resilient alternative explicit rather than aspirational. The de-dollarization effort by the BRICS coalition is the second crisis dimension, and the one that Jake Chervinsky has analyzed most extensively. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with the additional members that expanded the coalition in recent years, collectively represent approximately 40% of global GDP and more than 30% of global trade volume. Their stated goal of reducing dollar dependence in international trade settlement is not ideological posturing. It is a documented policy objective backed by the construction of actual payment infrastructure. China's CIPES system has been operating since 2015 and is processing an increasing share of China's international trade settlements. Russia's SPFS system, built as a SWIFT alternative after the 2014 Ukraine sanctions, is being integrated with CIPS. And the BRICS countries have been discussing the creation of a common settlement currency or settlement mechanism that bypasses the dollar entirely. Jake Chervinsky's analysis of the de-dollarization threat is specific about what it means for XRP. The American answer to de-dollarization cannot be more of the same SWIFT-based correspondent banking infrastructure that the BRICS coalition is building away from. It has to be infrastructure that provides better functionality than BRICS alternatives at lower cost with greater efficiency. American-built, American-regulated, blockchain-based payment infrastructure that is technically superior to CAPs, accessible to every financial institution that wants to use dollars without depending on correspondent banking relationships that the BRICS coalition is replacing, is the competitive response that Jake's framework identifies. Ripple's technology is that infrastructure, and the BRICS de-dollarization pressure is the competitive forcing function that makes the US government's adoption of Ripple's technology a national security imperative rather than a commercial convenience. The Federal Reserve's structural dilemma is the third crisis dimension that Jake Chervinsky analyzes in the context of XRP. The Fed's mandate requires it to manage domestic economic conditions through interest rate policy, but the dollar's reserve currency status requires it to maintain a monetary policy posture that supports global dollar demand. When those two requirements conflict, as they do in the current environment, where domestic economic conditions suggest rate reductions, while global dollar demand considerations suggest rate maintenance, the Fed's credibility is under stress. Jake's framework connects this stress to XRP through the observation that distributed ledger-based settlement reduces the structural dependence on Fed-intermediated dollar liquidity that makes correspondent banking vulnerable to the Fed's policy dilemmas. An institution that uses Ripple's on-demand liquidity for cross-border settlement does not need pre-funded Nostro account balances held in Fed-supervised correspondent banks. It uses XRP as the bridge asset and eliminates the Fed's role as the necessary liquidity provider for that settlement function. The crisis of Fed credibility is therefore simultaneously a commercial incentive for financial institutions to adopt Ripple's technology as a way to reduce their structural exposure to Fed policy uncertainty. Now let me bring in the institutional positioning, because Jake Chervinsky's crisis framework is not just analytical. It explains the behavior of institutions that have been building XRP positions in ways that the standard institutional adoption narrative does not fully capture. Goldman Sachs's $154 million disclosed XRP position is, in Jake Chervinsky's framework, not primarily a bet on XRP price appreciation. It is a positioning of capital in the infrastructure asset of the global financial order transition that the crisis is accelerating. Goldman's geopolitical risk analysis capability is unmatched in the private sector. Former CIA directors, former NSA officials, and former State Department officials cycle through Goldman's research and advisory functions. Goldman's geopolitical risk desk would have analyzed the Iran escalation, the BRICS de-dollarization trajectory, and the Federal Reserve's structural dilemma through the same lens that Jake Claver applies. And that analysis would have produced the same conclusion. The infrastructure asset at the center of the global financial order transition is XRP. Goldman's position is the commercial expression of geopolitical risk analysis that reaches the same destination as Jake's framework. Bank of America's Ripple patent portfolio built over a decade that included the 2008 financial crisis, the 2014 Russia sanctions that accelerated SWIFT vulnerability awareness, and the 2020 COVID shock that exposed the brittleness of correspondent banking infrastructure, is the corporate expression of a strategic planning process that was informed by each major crisis that Jake's framework identifies as an accelerant of the global financial order transition. The patent portfolio was not built in a single moment of clarity. It was built incrementally as each crisis demonstrated more urgency for the alternative payment infrastructure that Ripple's technology provides. The crisis did not create Bank of America's interest in Ripple. It deepened it progressively over a decade of strategic planning. BlackRock's approach to the $3 billion AUM threshold is being calibrated against a crisis environment that makes the timeline for XRP adoption more urgent than the standard institutional adoption model would suggest. BlackRock manages sovereign wealth fund assets from nations whose own crisis exposure is shaping their evaluation of dollar-denominated payment infrastructure alternatives. A sovereign wealth fund from an energy-producing nation watching the US-Iran escalation is simultaneously evaluating its exposure to the SWIFT-based payment system that the escalation has put under geopolitical pressure, and its exposure to the dollar-denominated assets, whose value is being shaped by the Federal Reserve's structural dilemma. BlackRock's ability to offer those clients XRP exposure through a regulated ETF is a product solution to a crisis-driven diversification need that the standard investment case for XRP does not fully capture. Now let me give you the supply dynamics, because Jake Claver's crisis framework hits the supply structure that makes the price implications of the transition more powerful than any previous XRP analysis has modeled. XRP has a circulating supply of 61.3 billion tokens. The effective free float available for institutional purchase at current prices has been shrinking throughout the crisis period as institutional accumulation has been absorbing available supply, and as the operational reserves of the financial institutions that have deployed Ripple's on-demand liquidity have locked XRP into settlement infrastructure rather than speculative trading positions. Ripple holds 34% in escrow. Long-term whale wallets hold approximately 17%. Approximately 60% of current holders are at unrealized losses and are not the sellers at current prices. The speculative trading float is small. The crisis adds a new demand dimension to the supply picture that Jake Claver specifically identifies in his framework. When governments and central banks begin evaluating XRP for reserve holding as a response to the de-dollarization pressure and the dollar alternative infrastructure that the BRICS coalition is building, the absorption of XRP into reserve portfolios is not trading demand, it is reserve demand. Reserve demand is the most structurally permanent form of demand that any asset can receive. Central banks do not day trade their reserves. They hold them through decades of market cycles, geopolitical crises, and monetary transitions. Every unit of XRP that enters central bank reserve holdings is permanently removed from the speculative trading float for the foreseeable future. The reserve demand layer that the crisis creates is the supply reduction mechanism that no standard XRP price model has incorporated, because no previous XRP price model was built on the assumption that central bank reserve holding was a near-term scenario. Jake Claver's crisis framework makes that assumption, and the evidence for it is accumulating. Let me give you the investment calculator, because the crisis-driven transition and Jake Claver's framework need to be grounded in portfolio terms. At $1.42, $1,000 buys you approximately 704 XRP. At $2.80, Standard Chartered's near-term institutional consensus and the first major resistance in the post-crisis institutional order book, those 704 tokens are worth $1,171. At $5, the lower bound of the crisis-accelerated repricing range that Jake's framework implies, they are worth $3,521. At $8, the upper bound of the near-term transition catalyst target, they are worth $5,632. At $12, the intermediate target that assumes the de-dollarization pressure drives central bank CBDC bridge adoption on the timeline Jake identifies, they are worth $8,448. At $20, the velocity model output for the scenario where the crisis accelerates the adoption timeline from the standard institutional model's 18 months to a 6-month window, they're worth $14,085. At $28, Standard Chartered's 2027 target They're worth $19,718. At $50, the scenario where the global financial order transition is underway and XRP's role as the primary cross-border settlement infrastructure is established, they're worth $35,200. At $100, the scenario where central bank reserve demand absorbs a significant portion of the speculative float and institutional operational demand fills the remainder, they're worth $70,400. At $5,000 invested, multiply every number by 5. At 10,000, multiply by 10. At 25,000, multiply by 25. The structural floor at 1.27 puts maximum downside at approximately 10%. Jake Claver's crisis framework, upside across documented transition and reserve demand targets, is 200 to over 6,800%. The crisis is not a headwind for XRP. In Jake Claver's framework, it is the most powerful tailwind that XRP has ever had. And the supply structure that the crisis hits is more constrained than at any point in XRP's history. Now let me lay out the catalyst sequence that Jake Claver's framework identifies, because the crisis is not a single event. It is a sequence of developments that each move the global financial order closer to the transition endpoint and each accelerate the XRP adoption timeline. The energy quarter escalation is the first catalyst in the sequence. Every escalation of military tension in the Persian Gulf demonstrates the vulnerability of the current correspondent banking infrastructure to geopolitical disruption. Each demonstration adds urgency to every financial institution's and government's evaluation of resilient alternatives. The urgency is not theoretical, it is operational. Treasury departments and risk management teams at major financial institutions are updating their correspondent banking resilience assessments in real time as the escalation unfolds. Ripple's technology is on every resilience assessment as the most mature available alternative. The Clarity Act passage is the legal catalyst that Jake's framework identifies as the trigger that converts crisis-driven urgency into institutional commitment. When permanent statutory certainty exists, the financial institutions whose crisis-driven resilience assessments have identified Ripple's technology as the optimal alternative can make contractual commitments to deployment rather than maintaining evaluation status indefinitely. Crisis urgency without legal certainty produces study groups. Crisis urgency with legal certainty produces procurement decisions. The Federal Reserve's next policy communication is the monetary catalyst that Jake's framework watches. When the Fed's next statement acknowledges the structural pressure on its monetary policy transmission from distributed ledger payment infrastructure, the institutional market receives the signal that the Fed's disintermediation concern has reached the public communication threshold. That threshold in Jake's framework is the signal that the transition from Fed-intermediated dollar settlement to XRP-mediated dollar settlement has reached the point where the most powerful monetary institution in the world can no longer avoid acknowledging it publicly. The first central bank reserve announcement is the terminal catalyst. When a G20 central bank publicly confirms that it is holding XRP in the de-dollarization pressure and the CBDC interoperability requirement that the transition creates, the global financial order transition is no longer a trajectory. It is a documented fact. The price discovery that follows that announcement reflects not the speculative demand for a cryptocurrency, but the reserve demand for an infrastructure asset that the global monetary system has adopted. Jake Claver's framework was built to identify the pathway to that announcement. The crisis has accelerated every step of that pathway. And the price at $1.42 is the market's current expression of its failure to take the crisis seriously as an XRP catalyst. Jake Claver was right about the framework. The crisis is changing the global financial order and XRP is at the center of the new order that is emerging from the chaos of the old one. Macro storms pass, infrastructure lasts. Smash that like button, drop your XRP position, and what do you think the first central bank reserve announcement means for the price in the comments. Let's see what this community understands about where the global financial order is heading. Subscribe and hit the bell. When the Clarity Act passes, when the escalation produces its first major financial infrastructure response, and when the first central bank reserve announcement lands, my breakdown is live within hours. The crisis is the catalyst. Jake Claver mapped the path. You were here when the community connected the dots. See you on the other side.